No.
Continue. Good. You're good. All right. Bye, Mrs. Stevens.
Bye.
I'll see you tomorrow. Enjoy.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, anyone there?
Yeah, Lou.
Yes.
Hello, it's me, Norma.
Hey, Norma. I know. I got you.
You do?
I do.
Oh, good. Oh, it feels good.
Good. Hey, Fred, you can see me, right? Fred,
Yeah, I'm here. I'm having trouble hearing you, though.
turn your volume up on your computer.
It is all the way up. You're just very low, I think, for some reason. I'm at max volume now.
Huh. How's your sound, Ursula? Okay.
I can't hear Ursula.
That's because she's muted.
I nodded my head. Sorry. Yeah, no, my sound is fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Fine.
All right.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, I've got my sound. I'm here. You see, if I turn up.
Oh, but you're okay over my earphones, so.
Oh, okay, great. All right. Welcome. Ooh, that looks good, Wendy. What is
Yeah,
that?
it is. It's dietetic, so don't get too excited,
Oh, it's all right.
but it's delicious.
I hope you brought some that you could share with the whole class.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah.
Thank you.
That frozen yogurt.
exactly.
Let's look at some Haydn symphonies now. We looked at a symphony very early to make the point that the symphony was something that was still very much in something that was evolving in the 1760s. Again, just a quick reminder, the symphony is, as a form, pieces that are called symphonies really don't start to emerge until the 1750s. The reason it's called a symphony is because the word means sounding together. So unlike a concerto, which features a soloist, apart from the whole, the orchestra, a symphony is a work sounding together. Just like all the music of the mid-century, it's aristocratic entertainment, basically. And we saw in Symphony number 21 that it's small. The whole symphony perhaps took 10 or 11 minutes. We can understand why Haydn wrote 104 symphonies while Beethoven only wrote 9. Beethoven wasn't a slacker. He changed the symphony. For him, every symphony was the creation of its own world. For Haydn, they were smaller works for a long time, and they slowly evolved and they slowly grew. The idea of a symphony orchestra, first of all, why were orchestras called symphonies? You know, why is it the Boston Symphony? Simply because so many pieces in the 1750s and 60s started to be written for this combination of instruments that the organization itself just started to be called a symphony orchestra. And the reason why it was called an orchestra is we know that the first level of the theater is the orchestra level. And it would be on that level that instruments would play. They weren't up on some stage. So the idea of a symphony over the 1760s, 70s, into the 1780s evolves as the primary, most important, shall we say, work for orchestra that isn't a concerto, that's not meant to feature one particular instrument in a solo capacity. In in doing so, the composers felt a little freer gradually to write whatever they wanted for the orchestra, meaning they weren't restricted to writing a particular type of music that would feature a soloist. If you're writing a piano concerto, the music has to be designed to feature that player, or a violin concerto, or a concerto for any particular instrument. For an orchestra, you don't have those restrictions. Another thing to keep in mind is that over the course of the 1750s, 60s, 70s, independent orchestras, separate from the court, separate from church, started to form in different cities. And they modeled themselves after this very successful orchestra in Mannheim, Germany, where a fellow named Johann Steinmetz was a favored composer, and he wrote many pieces for them that he called symphonies. And so that begins to be followed. And the rise of the independent orchestra isn't quite as we think of it today, meaning orchestras started to form that were now public orchestras, meaning performing for the public. They were still largely bankrolled by the aristocracy or by the court. But these were for concert series that were now available to the public. The public was still primarily aristocratic, but this is a period when the rise of this merchant class, this upper middle class, wanting some of the accoutrement of the upper class, leads to the creation of public venues for concerts. Some cities were much further ahead than others at this point. For instance, London had a thriving concert scene, public concert scene, before Vienna did. Paris's scene in the 1880s was still strongly aristocratic in both funding or royal. But Paris and Vienna both have emerging public concert scenes. So a piece that's written for the largest grouping, for an environment that will play to the largest possible audience of that age, that moment in time, takes on the quality of wanting to be both sophisticated but accessible. So the two most important forms that emerge in the era are the string quartet and the symphony. The symphony is the public form for the big orchestra. The quartet is the more private, aristocratic world piece. The very first public concert of a string quartet was the Schuppanzich quartet around the time Beethoven wrote the Razumovskys. So this is 1805, 1806. So the quartets existing in a more rarefied world flattered their aristocratic patrons and were a little more sophisticated, more interplay, more counterpoint often, more contrapuntal. And the design of four individual players having a conversation lends itself to that kind of differentiating of voices. The symphony becomes the most important, larger public work. And in terms of, let's say, experimentation for composers, they will always be ahead of, the string quartet will always be ahead of where the symphony is. Mozart's doing things in quartets in the early 1780s that he'll put into symphonies in 1787, 88. Haydn, same thing with Beethoven. So that's the difference. The symphony, by the early 1780s with Haydn, has reached a strong sense of maturity. And I hope we're going to listen to two works tonight. The first is from 1780. It's symphony number 73. It's subtitle, which Haydn did not give himself, The Chase. It's The Hunt. And here's a little bit of a backstory about this symphony. It got subtitled The Hunt because of the fourth movement, which clearly uses hunting horn calls as the main theme. It's scored for what was a rather standard orchestra at this time, which included one or two flutes. In this case, he wrote for one. He'd have two oboes, no clarinets yet. Clarinets were still not a regular member of the orchestra. Two bassoons. And then usually two French horns, and a full complement of strings. Strings always being violins 1, violins 2, violas, cellos, basses. Even though that's 5 groups of strings, at this time, the basses tend to play generally what the cellos play, but an octave lower. They don't often have their own independent part, and if the cellos get something really fast, the basses will often play a simplified version of it. So these 5 string sections are, can I ask you a question? When I highlight something in the chat, do you see it highlighted right now? No? Okay, cool. So these 5 string section parts are really 4 at this stage of orchestral development. Some versions also include a more thorough use of trumpets and timpani. But when they do, they only are included in the finale. And in reality, for the way Haydn wrote it, they are not part of the score. Sometimes people have just added them in. So this is a rather typical orchestra. The violins, there might be 4 to 6 of each group, maybe 4 violas, 4 cellos, perhaps 2 basses. So your string complement might be as many as 20, perhaps. 2 French horns, 2 bassoons, 2 oboes, a flute. You've got roughly a 30-person orchestra. At this time, Haydn did not have a 30-person orchestra at Esterhazy. The largest it ever got by the late 1780s was 25. If he was able to get even more players, what he'd add is more strings. So you may end up, like the maximum you'd have might be 8 violins in each section, 6 violas, 5 or 6 cellos, 3 basses. So that's where the orchestra gets larger and can push you to a 40-person orchestra at this time. In the 1790s, trumpets will be a regular part of the orchestra. Clarinets will be a regular part of the orchestra. He'll be lured to London with this larger string complement. And so a 50-person orchestra for the late Haydn works would have not been unusual. To give you a sense that Haydn also had this, he was very fluid with his music. He was like Bach. Bach reused material when the material seemed especially effective and was part of a piece that perhaps he thought was, how shall we say, retired. The second movement, for instance, of this is based on a Haydn song. The finale of this symphony started life as an overture to a Haydn opera called Fidelity Rewarded. And I don't think they're talking about the investment company right there with that. And the hunting melody of the finale is a quotation from even an earlier piece than that. Divertimento, which was by a French composer named Jean-Baptiste Morin. So very much like Bach, not only is he repurposing music he wrote for other occasions when it seemed like this is too good an idea to just let sit there, and sometimes building his work on not only his own material, but on themes of others. So let's just jump into it, because as I said, I hope that what we're going to do today is be able to listen to 2 symphonies from the early to mid 1780s, so we can get a glimpse of this with Haydn as in this first absolute full maturity as a symphonic composer. You know, I can find a version that we can watch it performed, but not continuous. So I'd have to switch, which is okay, I guess. I'd have to, here. Yeah, see, I can only get one movement at a time. So if it would be worth it, if you enjoy seeing it, we can approach it that way. So hold on one second. Let me get the first movement. This is the finale. Yeah, part 1. I assume they mean movement 1. Okay, now, what do we expect? The form of the symphony and the form of the string quartet are essentially the same. Each one kind of the most sophisticated form of the instrumental genres of the era. In this case, we get a sonata form first movement, but Haydn is starting now to do something he hadn't done before. He's starting to begin a sonata form with a slow introduction. Now, we heard Beethoven do that, but this is where that begins. The idea was that in the Esterhazy court, certainly, he had written many symphonies. People were familiar with the approach, the form, movement, form, coalescing. The expectation is for the allegro to kick in, the main theme to kick in. And around this time, 1780, when this is one of the first examples, he begins with a slow introduction. Initially, it creates a disorientation to the listener because they're expecting an allegro. It also creates this sense of anticipation. When will the allegro kick in? Isn't that how a symphony begins? The other thing I want you to notice is that the first thing you hear, the repeated note accompaniment. Hear that, right? Well, once again, Haydn is going to create this merging of theme and accompaniment. The repeated note motive will become the opening motive of the theme. I don't know the timings on this one. I have other timings here, but let's see if I can find it. Are you hearing okay? Here we are. Ba, 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 right? Begins the melody, and then you listen to the accompaniment. Ba, ba, ba. So once again, the repeated notes that begin the intro are used as main theme and accompaniment, essential motive of the allegro. And so as he starts to expand and eventually develop and work with the main theme, when you hear a repeated note, the repeated note figure, are you hearing the theme? Are you hearing the accompaniment? Well, you're hearing it all. And that became one of his, I talked about this last week, one of his essential techniques for unifying a composition and making it feel as if everything comes from an essential source. So, sonata form, we'll hear a main theme, transitional material, but here's where Haydn is different from Mozart and often Beethoven. He tends not to give you a traditional second theme, that lyrical contrast. Instead, he'll tend to expand the first theme, give you a couple of transitional ideas that thrust you forward, and then a closing theme is the new idea. Again, Haydn building more from the essential material than always favoring highly contrasting material. So, the only thing I don't know about this performance, since I don't know this particular performance, is whether or not they repeat the allegro. And if they do, we expect the repeat to not go back to the beginning, but to the beginning of the allegro, the beginning of the first theme. So here we go. Gotcha. Allegro. Main theme. Expanded. Shifting key. Closing. Repeat the exposition. Expanding and transition. Repeated note. Melody. Keys shifting. Echo. Strips it away. All repeatedly. Put back. movement 1. This is sonata form at its first full maturity. Clear exposition, development, return. No real coda yet. A little small tail, barely. And Haydn's idea of creating this unified texture by, in one way or another, building everything out of that essential motif. And something I think he does really beautifully in that development section is strip away everything else. And it's just the ba 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 dee da da da, which by the way sounds a lot like Beethoven's Fifth from 28 years later. Just as a phrase being passed around different instruments of the orchestra, key shifts while he's doing it, unexpected moments of silence. So that's the first movement. The second movement is this instrumental adaptation of a song from that he had written. Now, when you read about this, you'll be told that the form is a rondo. So our expectations of a rondo would look something like this. Right? One main idea returning to set off contrasting ideas that not only contrast with the main idea, but also with each other. Well, this is more typical of Mozart. For a slow movement, Mozart and Haydn, when they would use rondo, would often make it a little more compact. But here's the key difference. With Mozart, the contrasting sections are usually new material, new melodies. It's what we often expect in a rondo, a new idea, a new melodic idea that it contrasts in feel, tone, character with the main idea. And then after we return, yet another idea that would contrast with both of what preceded it. That's what we more expect from Mozart in retrospect. Haydn tended to make his departures developmental. So instead of B and C, as I've called them there, being new material, something I encourage you guys to do with Haydn in general is to think of rondo is formed like this. Or here, hang on. I'll do it this way. You get the main idea, which would a good tune. Then you get the first departure, which is more development. Then you'd come back to the main material again. Rehear it, maybe abbreviated, maybe complete, but a clear return. But instead of thinking, oh, well, I'm expecting to go to something new and different still, nope. You just think of it as another departure. These departures as developments as opposed to new material. And then eventually a return. You follow? If you think of a rondo that way, as a primary idea that sets off a series of departures, then you can be open to the idea, well, maybe that departure will be new material, or maybe that departure will be development, kind of free-flowing development of what we've heard. And that's more what we get here. So it starts out as a song, and remember, a song, well, we expect a main tune, a bridge, and then in this case, instead of coming back, we get a little closing phrase. And so this is the main material. the shape of it. Here we go. Then the bridge builds from the end. Closing bridge. And repeat. The main tune. The bridge. The closing. Now the first departure. Minor hit. Built from empty. Built from the closing. Playing the main theme material. And now the first return reorchestration to feature the flute. And the bridge. And the closing. And right to expand. Minor again, your second departure. Further development. And then a tutti, everyone. A return. And the third movement. What do we expect? What do you guys expect from a third movement? Do you know yet? A minuet, right? Minuetto. And if you recall, this is as close to a predictable form as you can get in a symphony or quartet. The large form is A, B, A, with each intersection a song like A, B, A. Remember the middle section is known as the trio, right? Although it's not literally a trio, it's where we expect to hear often the simplest material, where the first section is often the tutti, and at a forte, the trio is a lighter, gentler, thinner orchestration, often at a pianissimo. And he is establishing these conventions now. When we get at the end of the large B, the end of the trio, he doesn't write out the minuet again. He writes da capo al fine. Go back to the beginning, play the minuet again, often without any of the inner repeats, under the assumption that you already have heard it. You don't need all of the inner repeats. We know the tempo of a minuet, a kind of stately 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, or something in that vicinity. And we also know that these were not meant to be danced. These are stylizations of the most popular court dance. And its role in the symphony is to provide a sense of relaxation, a moment of, you just heard two different movements that each in their own way were developing and transforming material. Now's a movement where you sit back and enjoy the tunes, relax. No sense of following transformation. I'm not sure if I said this to you. Note the trio, interestingly here, will feature the oboe in the lead. And the bridge. Back. Trio. the finale. The finale is probably why this work still remains as popular as it is. It's the hunt. It's a sonata form. Main theme and a closing phrase to the main theme, and then a second theme and a closing phrase for it. Develop, return, and so on. But remember, this was originally written as the prelude to an opera. But this sort of hunting rhythm and tune was always very popular. And this is part of what made Haydn so popular. This feeling as if he was composing or building works from stuff that feels like it comes more from the earth, you know, so you won't mistake the strong hunting theme. It's the second theme. It'll be the French horns with the oboes adding some brightness on top. Here we go, the finale. Another sonata form. And closing. and one of the few Haydn symphonies that ends quietly, unexpectedly so. So this is an example of the beginning of the mature style of the symphony, 1780. 4 movements, a work that might last 20 to 25 minutes, that would have a sonata form first movement, a minuet third movement, either a rondo finale, or if it's a little more kind of sophisticated, another sonata form finale, as this one did. And in this case, it surprises us by having a second movement that's more than just a song, but it was a more developmental rondo as well. And this is the tone, you know. This is Haydn. His understanding with his audience was to surprise them, but to please them. This was not a period of even Beethoven's sense that I'm going to write in a way that is going to possibly make you uncomfortable. No interest in that. The last 20 years of the 18th century may be the last time in the history of concert music where there was an understood, unspoken agreement between the composer and his audience. He knew who his audience was. He knew what they wanted. They wanted to be charmed, pleased, delighted, entertained, moved, but not disturbed, not frustrated, not confused, which is why as Mozart's music starts to get more complicated in the latter part of the 1780s, he starts to alienate some of his audience. It was a sense of, for the composer, how can I give you what you want, but surprise you at the same time? Do things that are unexpected. So the more we understand what was expected, the more we actually end up, I think, enjoying and appreciating what Haydn did, because he's constantly varying from what now would seem utterly predictable, mundane path. I mean, there was that moment right before the return where he took off on this wild thing. Let me see if I can find that. Here. You know, if an audience expected development, build up, and then return, they're going to be sitting there thinking, what is this? Is this a new theme? What's he doing at this moment? And it's wonderful and it's exciting. And the whole orchestra is playing in unison, right? There's no accompaniment parts. It's everybody in all the octaves on that theme. So in a myriad of ways, Haydn is both trying to please and satisfy, but surprise. And the degree to which he succeeded, I think, is a reflection that we're still listening to him. Now, around this time, early 1780s, some of Haydn's music is performed in Paris. There was a Stabat Mater that was performed. Certain symphonies were being published and performed. in Paris. He was popular. He receives a commission to compose music for this new orchestra. It's called the Concert de la Loge Olympique. Terrible accent, but I hope you get to enjoy it. And it was a fellow Chevalier de Saint George, who was the musical director, who commissions it, but it's the Count d'Ogny, D''O''G''N', who was the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge, the Masonic Loge Olympique. So this orchestra is an outgrowth of the Masonic Lodge. And Haydn was a member of the Masonic Lodge in Vienna, though he wasn't a very active member, considering he was rarely in Vienna. So they commissioned Haydn to write 6 symphonies. It gave Haydn a great opportunity, one that quite literally he couldn't resist. First, the orchestra was going to have 67 players. Right, wow. So for Haydn, he'd never, his orchestra at Esterhazy at this point is 25 players. It's 3 times the size of his orchestra. That was the first thing. The second thing was that the players, it was a good orchestra, but at this time, orchestras that large could only be that large because they were a mix of professional and amateur players. Do you remember we talked about that with Beethoven, that was often the way his works were performed? But the audience who would be attending these concerts would be made up of primarily the upper classes, the aristocracy, the plutocracy. So even though they were open to the public, they were thoroughly supported by that count and attended by the who's who of French society. And the financial terms that Haydn was offered was compelling. I'll read you what they were. The equivalent of 225 gulden per symphony. All right, so how does that translate? Well, remember, Haydn's salary at this point is 600 gulden a year. So he's being commissioned to write 6 works that would more than double his salary for those 6 works. It was literally, the commission was worth more than 2 years of his salary. And in addition, he would be able to arrange for additional payment through the folks who are commissioning it, the publication of the work in Paris. Subsequently, he was also able to arrange the publications of the work in London. Now, one writer who's, I've read a couple of his books, H.C. Robbins Landon, about Haydn. He said the musicians wore splendid sky blue dress coats with elaborate lace ruffles, and I love this, and swords at their sides. So just in case anybody in the audience didn't like the music, they were prepared. They performed in a large theater. They had boxes and tiers. As I said, the upper part of society attended these, and in the one in particular that we're going to listen to became nicknamed the Queen because Queen Marie Antoinette loved this symphony the best of all. So it became known as the Queen. The fellow who commissioned it, I'm not sure how to pronounce this. I'll write it out for you. It's oh no, I added a K in there, sorry. So Donye, so let's just call him the Count. He was still in his late 20s when he commissioned these. And, or in his 20s, he was born in 1757. So yeah, mid to late 20s. He played cello in the orchestra. He was a good amateur cellist. He grew up in a very musical household. And this orchestra was predated in France by an orchestra called the Concert de, forgive, it's de amateur, the orchestra of amateur orchestra, using the term amateur in the true sense of the word, people who do it for love. That was an orchestra that had played some of Haydn's symphonies up to through 1781, including the Hunt. It dissolved in 1781, and this orchestra, the Concert Olympique, took its place. And primarily on the patronage of the Count, and his own musical patronage may have been, even for him, excessive because he left a huge debt upon his death in 1790. So these symphonies were terrifically well received at the time in France. Very popular when they were published. They were soon published in London after they were published in Vienna, excuse me, in Paris. If you recall, there were no copyright laws that covered the copyright from city to city. We talked about that, did we not? So the best a composer could do would be to try to arrange simultaneous publishing in different cities. Because if he could benefit financially. Otherwise, as soon as it was published in one place, it would have been published, picked up and bootlegged and published elsewhere. One thing about this one, we know it was completed in 1785 or 1786 when it was premiered. And early on in a keyboard arrangement, it made its way to the United States and was performed by a woman named Nellie Custis at the White House. Now, Custis, we know, is the family name of George Washington's wife. So I have to assume that Nellie playing this keyboard arrangement was a relative. It's scored for the same orchestra as we heard the Hunt: flute, oboes, bassoons, horns, and strings. No trumpets yet. Trombones aren't used in an orchestra in a symphony until Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. They tended to be used only in opera and in or sacred music. The first movement, Haydn actually makes a reference to an earlier symphony of his, and the second movement is a set of variations on a French song, on an old French folk song. So let's start listening. Again, I hope you are becoming confident with the meaning of when I refer to something of Haydn's as more monothematic. Monothematic meaning instead of the contrasting second theme, it's more expanded development of the first theme. He uses a rhythm in the adagio introduction of the first movement that has a da, 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 kind of long, short, long rhythm. That's indicative of a French style of opera overture. So he's tipping his hat to the French with the adagio that delays the allegro. Here we go. This is Roger Norrington, and I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe that these may be original instruments. We'll see as we go. Norrington did a lot of work with original instruments. We'll see if the horns have valves. I don't know, that flute looks more metal than wooden, so perhaps they're not. Here we go. Exposition. That theme again, it's unusual, isn't it? This descending staccato accompaniment against the sustained melodic. Main theme again. theme again, where we expect a new theme. And it's a new key. to me, there's a kind of significant step forward in these Paris symphonies. They're even more surprising. They're fresher. They have more psychological depth. They surprise us more by going into minor and unexpected. There's hints of Beethoven, of what he will do in that. The way that the graceful melody and that staccato accompaniment work together is just terrific. And then the accompaniment itself has enough melodic profile that when he starts to develop, suddenly he's developing that, and that becomes thematic, and the sustains are accompanying it. You know, I think it's really quite beautiful. The second movement, he calls a romance, and the tempo is allegretto, moderately fast, moderate really, and it's based on an old French folk song. And now we see a form that becomes not exactly common, but, you know, Haydn will use with some frequency in second movement, and that's theme and variations. And so if you recall, the very first thing that'll happen in a theme and variations is that you are going to hear just a straightforward statement of the theme. So let's call the theme, it's an entire song form. So we hear a tune, it repeats, we hear a bridge, which the bridge just expands the A material. And then we return, but vary to conclude. We repeat the B, and we repeat the A variation. Take a look. So we've got a tune, it'll repeat. We get the bridge, which is an expansion of this main material. Then the main material returns, but it's going to vary to resolve because it doesn't resolve here. And then he'll repeat the bridge and he'll repeat that. Okay? Basic song form. Why? Simple, because it's what he's going to do with it, right? And remember, each variation is the length of this original song. The chord progression stays the same, but ornamentation, decoration, new accompaniments, shift from major to minor, rhythmic shifts, but the structural essence remains the same. The only thing he might not always do is take all the inner repeats. Based on an old French folk song, the name of which I forget, but I can look it up. What's it called? La gentille et jeune Lisette. Repeat. Main. And bridge. To return, will resolve. Repeat the bridge. Two. Variation 1. Second variation. Minor. Shift to major. Repeat. And variation 3, a flute obbligato. While the strings hold down the theme. Variation 4. Assume. Very chromatic. And flute. Third movement. What do we expect? I hope the answer is a minuet, and that you also have a sense of how it would be formed. So let's see how he'll do this one. Wonderful featuring of the bassoon. Surprises us. Stanza. Now, from a finale, what might be something to expect? A rondo. And that's what we'll get. And once again, a main tune, a bridge, a return, and then the departures are developments. Let's listen to the finale of the Queen Symphony. Features bassoon again. So these are two symphonies, 1780, 1785. And this is the mature classical style now. And by, as each class goes on, at least on 2 more occasions, I hope I'll be able to play you 2 works each time, because what I'm trying to give you is this sense of what are your expectations, and then where will he surprise you, both in the big picture of how he structures a movement or in the inner details. But these symphonies were terrifically successful. At this point, Haydn is recognized as the not only most popular, but most admired composer in Europe. His work was more accessible than Mozart's and had already traveled further, traveled more to Paris. And even though he had not yet been, London, for instance, loved Haydn's music and was performing it a lot. I think I mentioned that last week. So, thoughts or questions? Okay. Then you guys are off the hook now. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to go back again next week and take the string quartet further. And to me, they just get more. His quartets are my favorite compositions. And a lot of it is, the more I came to understand what was expected, the more I came to understand everything he was doing to subvert that. And so I hope I'll be able to take you further in that way. I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. See you.